Hi BookTube and welcome to a new video. This is a recent reads for 4 novels, 4 poetry collections and 1 hybrid work. So the first is Vincent Delecroix, Small Boat, French author. This has been longlisted for the International Booker Prize this year, translated by Helen Stevenson. Invisible Dogs by Charles Boyle. Roberto Bolano, By Night in Chile, translated by Chris Andrews. Robert Perisic, A Cat at the End of the World, translated by Vesna Malic. And then the hybrid work is Kathleen Jamie's Cairn. And the poetry, Natalie Diaz, When My Brother Was an Aztec. Nick Laird, Up Late. Juliana Spahr, This Connection of Everyone with Lungs. And finally, Austrian poet Frederike Mayrocker, As Mornings and Mossgreen I Step to the Window. So as usual, I will start with the prose. And first is this Small Boat, 120 pages, but an awful lot packed into it. I really enjoyed this. So it's about, or based on a true story. Those outside of the continent of Europe, or the EU at least, may not be aware that there's lots of migrants trying to cross from mainland Europe to the UK. Where it's seen as a more tolerant, accepting society, which is highly dubious, but they're English speaking, which obviously can affect people's choice of where to live, and a perception that I think is more based on the indigenous British than migrants, that it's a free ride, it's an easy ride once you get there and on the benefit system, which is not true. But this is the propaganda put out. Anyway, the true story this is based on, I mean, there have been many lives lost in these crossings, because the English Channel is a very dangerous sort of small waterway if you've not got, proper boats. And then we talk about people who are basically in dinghies with outboard motors. Many people have died, have drowned in these crossings. This relates to one in particular, where 27 of 29 people drowned, and was political football. It was kicked between the British Coast Guard and the French Coast Guard, because apparently there are territorial waters, and if a boat has crossed from one into the other, the one, in this case France, can say it's not their problem anymore, even though they're probably closer for them to get to than the British. But I'll come to all of that. So the structure of this book is that a Coast Guard radio operator in France is being interrogated or interviewed by a police inspector who looks just like her, as to her role, her part, her responsibility in the tragedy, whether her decision making was good, and certain things that were caught on the recorded tape that she said, what do they indicate about her? And straight away this put me in mind of Albert Camus' The Outsider, because although this woman is on trial, like Meursault was on trial in The Outsider, they're not on trial for the supposed crime. They're on trial for their morality, their perceived morality, their perceived indifference. And equally, as with Meursault, it's really society hiding its own moral hypocrisy by not having that exposed, by sort of scapegoating one person. And this is very similar indeed. So the charge is that she said one lie, and one lie that she didn't say but perhaps ought to have said. So the lie that she said was that help was coming, but we realised earlier that help wasn't coming, because the British and the French were, as I say, playing dodgeball, playing tag, to avoid having to deal with this, and in the end there was no help going to reach them in time. So that was a lie. And when she said help is coming, she knew at that point no help from the French side was coming, and that the English had set out but were further away. So that was the lie that she told. The lie that she didn't tell was when the same guy who'd called her 14 times from the sinking boat, she told him that they weren't going to be saved. And the lie that she should have said, according to societal norms, she should have given them a white lie. She should have given them hope, saying, yes, you will be saved. Even if it wasn't true, it might have made them less panicky and might have been able to get to hang on for a bit longer. So the judgment is a social white lie would have been apposite then, but she didn't resort to that. Instead, she says the exact opposite. Don't you realise you won't be saved? So the brutal truth there was actually more pernicious, more harmful than a lie. So the book is really an investigation into sort of society's morals, as I say, channeling, focusing on one scapegoat. And indeed, the author, Vincent Delecroix, is mainly a philosopher. He's not a fiction writer. His expertise is Soren Kierkegaard's philosophy. But what I think raises this book slightly above, I thought, okay, this is very Camus-like, very The Outsider-like. It's sort of slightly sort of ideas-based because you talk about morality and things. But what actually raised it above that into a much more profound book was the notion of sort of social talk, social conversation. Because she says, she's relating how every time she goes to visit her parents, she has to visit them a lot because she's a single mother and she has a daughter, and when she's doing night shift she has to sort of drive her daughter 4 hours to her parents to look after the kid. But every time she does it, her father sort of beams with pride and sort of taps her hand or grabs her hand and sort of says, "You save people." And it drives her insane that this has become like a catchphrase because it's emptied of meaning. First of all, she doesn't save people. She directs other people rescuing boats to save people. But it's an important, role within the chain. But even that's not what really gets her annoyed. It's that her father has boiled down his complete sort of lack of articulation to this one phrase to express his pride in his daughter. But he has nothing else to say. No other arrows in his quiver about his relationship to his daughter. And it's so transparent to her that it drives her mad every time he says this. And she tries to grab her hand away before he can grab it to sort of pat her on the hand and things. And I relate that back to the notion of the social white lie, because she can't stand people who sort of mutter these, who utter these sort of prosaic, everyday, banal, meaningless things, in the same way that she wasn't prepared to spin a white lie in her profession. And I always am very taken with sort of explorations of this type of banal, expected social etiquette language. And I thought it was a very good sort of representation of that. So the thrust of the arguments against her is, they say, well, you come over really badly on this tape recording because you said two things. You said you will not be saved. You also said, I didn't ask you to leave the land, i.e. to start on your journey to cross over. And this is obviously where her argument implied, or then, she doesn't come out with it directly to the police interviewer, is that the world is responsible for driving these people to desperation, to hunger, to poverty, to walk through war, to seek their lives elsewhere, to make this dangerous crossing. We're all guilty, but by having this sort of focus on her, the rest of society, the rest of the world, the rest of the planet is able in a way to sort of cover its own eyes and ears to its own part in this tragedy. And the police inspector sort of says to her, is this pure negligence or incompetence, or is there something deeper? Are you basically racist? Do you despise and look down at these people? And she says, no, professionally, like any policeman, like any soldier, we have to be completely neutral. We can't get involved with the people. even though they're sort of distant on a mobile phone. You know, we can't let our emotions be exposed to this. And the police inspector comes back and says, well, if that's the case, why did you say you shouldn't have left your, you know, where you were from? Because that implies that you have made a moral judgment, that these people are inferior to the playboy who gets into difficulties in his yacht, who you're saying equally you would save. And that's not the case. That there is a morality, that these people who are circumstances are far more stricken than the playboy on his yacht. You know, in a way you should look to do more to save them. Again, this is the hypocrisy of the world, of society, where the radio operators thinking, well, I don't see you going out to rescue them. You all talk a good game, but none of you do anything about it. So these are the arguments, and as I say, at times I was thinking, well, you know, this is all very interesting, but when you introduce the banality of evil, and you sort of indirectly and implicitly are talking about Hannah Arendt and the Nazis, you know, this is Goodwin's law. I mean, they never actually raised. No, I think they do raise the spectre of the Nazis here. It's the same argument about, yes, we all know how terrible the Nazi leaders were, but actually there were lots of ordinary people, ordinary functionaries actually carrying out these things and seeing it with their own eyes, and they didn't sort of bat an eyelid either. And you always get a bit worried when that sort of argument is roped in. But as I say, the writing here elevates it above that. And just to give you two examples, it was also that I wanted to hear myself. I mean, hear and not read myself, read my words in the newspaper, hear my own voice and not the voice of the journalist repeating on the television what I said, alongside expressions like migrant drama, migrant tragedy, as though every evening at 8 o'clock we were at the theatre and they were putting on the same play. And it really is the same play with me in the front row. I never miss a performance. I show up every evening for the migrant drama. They give me a free seat and even pay me for it. Some people are in boxes, some in the gallery, but they give me a lookout post in the front row so I can see clearly. That way I'm both in the front row and in the dress circle looking out at the sea. And even if the title of the play varies, sometimes migrant drama, sometimes migrant tragedy, drama in the Channel, or sometimes drama in the Mediterranean, of course, it's always the same play and always the same character. And at one point, the character picks up a phone to address the audience. I just think that's a brilliant sort of damning of sort of rolling news and the manufacture of news, the production of news, the cycle of news. We're always getting these sort of buzzwords, when actually what it is, as she says, is, well, every night migrants are in these dodgy boats. Some make it, some don't. And it's my night in the spotlight because it happened on my watch. But this is going on every night. Hence it's like, you know, a run of the same play, the same performance in a theatre. I just think that was really sharp, really prescient. So I'd say this surprisingly, in its sort of 120 pages, packs in a real lot. You know, you've got the moral discussion. You've got the sort of the Camus notion of society hiding behind justice by prosecuting individuals when we're all equally guilty. We're all being hypocritical about our own morality by criticising the non-morality seemingly of another person. Terrific stuff, 5 stars. And, you know, I don't know if it made the shortlist of the Booker International, but I kind of hope it wins. Not that I've read any of the others. 5 stars. And on to Charles Boyle, Invisible Dogs. I'm rating this as fiction. It says fiction on the back under the price, but it seems to be based on what used to be called fact-finding tours. I'm not sure if they still are, where authoritarian countries lay on a guided tour for, say, a couple of weeks of their country, show them all the bountiful, beneficial things it's done in order to hide its sort of dark secrets. It's really a propaganda tour. And the main character in here is a writer, and he's going with another writer of his acquaintance, but they're not close friends. The other writer is much more mainstream and successful than our protagonist is. And it's called Invisible Dogs because very early on in the tour they're told that there was a problem with sort of feral dogs in the cities, and the government issued an order for them all to be basically rounded up and shot. and this is what happened, and therefore there are no more wild dogs on site out in the streets. Only the protagonist swears he keeps seeing these dogs, thereby giving the lie to the claim of the government. And of course, dogs can stand in for political people, journalists, dissidents, all these sorts of things. They're made to disappear and not spoken about. And their tour guide deny, even though our protagonist says, "I'm sure I saw a dog," the tour guide will say, "No, all the dogs have been killed." And there are lots of things like that that they're not allowed to see, or if they see and ask about it, they go, "No, it's not there, it doesn't exist." But it's not just about the fact finding, it's about the relationship of these two writers, because they're basically under guard, because they have these minders and translators watching them all the time, because of course the government doesn't want to see things they're not supposed to see. So they get very restless in very different ways, the different characters. But the beauty of this book is that Charles Boyle is just such a great writer, has such a great turn of phrase, and I'm just going to read 3. Cranes during the day perform a slow-motion ballet, awkwardly thrust up into public view. They too are quite shy, really. They didn't set out to be phallic, just to perform a basic mechanical task. At night they wear dinky red lights, canis major. If I join up the lights on the cranes, I can see from my room, I find that I've drawn a dog. The damp patch on the carpet in my room has returned, near but not in the same place as before, playing hard to get. Even if this one dries out, I will now be expecting another. These things come in threes, like buses and suitors and Goldilocks bears and Lear's daughters and his dogs too. Nothing new under the sun. It's bleak out there, but inside the train I'm comfortable and warm. Womb temperature. So, it's one of those books just to bask in. It's quite slight in its way, but the writing is so beautiful. It's very quick to read, and it's an absolute pleasure. 5 stars. And on to Roberto Bolano, By Night in Chile. So the only 2 Bolanos I read are his big works, 2666 and Savage Detectives. And for me, I just didn't see the appeal of them. To me, they were Emperor's New Clothes. So I'd given up on Bolano. But lots of people talk about this. By Night in Chile is probably his best work, and it has the advantage of being short, not a maximalist work. And I read it, and I will say it's very, very good. And in a way, I could see the bones or the skeleton of something like 2666 done here first, previously, because 2666 was an unfinished work, or not completed before his death anyway. But because it's done more pithily, more sort of economically, it's far more enjoyable here than it is in, say, 2666. So what do I mean? So it's about someone who is a literary critic and a poet in his youth, and he trains for the clergy. Being Chile, this is the Roman Catholic Church, and indeed Opus Dei, which is a very kind of fundamentalist branch of Catholicism. But he retains his critical literary writing and his poetry. He does them both, as well as being a priest. And there are several episodes in the book. I mean, it's essentially a book of episodes which give you an insight into the changing culture and times of Chile during Bolano's life. And these episodes are great fun. I mean, this book is great fun. So, for example, he's commissioned to take a tour of European churches in order to find out how they're preserved, because obviously some of them are a lot older than the ones in Chile, which only came after the conquistadors. And the Chilean churches are starting to fall into disrepair. So he's told to go on, yes, another fact-finding mission, to see what the Europeans are doing to preserve their churches, particularly from bird guano and stuff like that, which sort of erodes the stone. And we get a very sort of list-like version of the fact that all of these churches that he visits are using falcons to keep the pigeons away, so that the pigeons can't crap on the churches. And it's a list that reminded me very heavily of the list of dead women in Bolano's 2666. But again, it's much more economical here, much more light in tone, much more enjoyable. Another episode is, because he's a poet and a literary critic, he's in with the Bohemians, but when Pinochet comes to power, there's a curfew. So how do these people get by the curfew? Well, they have, I think they're weekly meetings. It might be more frequent than that. They have weekly get-togethers in this big house, the same house every party, and they just while the night away inside this house, being bohemian, discussing art and things like that. Again, very enjoyable, very entertaining. And then the last episode is he's approached by the guys who commissioned him to do the church tour. They've got a special offer to him that he can't refuse, and it turns out that he's to teach Pinochet and his junta all about communism and its appeals, because obviously the communists are the defeated opponents from when Pinochet's coup led him to take power, but is still perceived as a threat, and so they want to know, know thy enemy. So he is teaching Pinochet, and I think they have 9 sessions, and that was really, really good. So you get this sort of sense of starting off with him training in the clergy and that sort of tough monastic life, but then the bohemian side of things, Chile opening out into the world in the sense that he goes out to Europe to see all these churches, and the humour of the falcon hunt and the pigeons, ending finally with Pinochet wanting to know how best to defeat his enemies. So it was really good. Again, it's short, it's easy to read, it's entertaining, it's funny. It's still a good sort of summary, really, of the changes to Chile during that period. So I really liked it. 4 stars. Does it mean I'm converted to Bolano to read more of his work? No, because in a way I wish he'd stuck with this formula rather than onto the sort of more maximalist works he went on to. I'd say 4 stars. And on to Robert Perisic, Croatian author, whose 2 previous books, Our Man in Iraq, and I can't remember the other one, I've really both liked, but they're very sort of grounded in the now. They're sort of very sort of political, they're very trenchant, quite hard-hitting. This is a world removed. This is almost like a fable, set in the ancient classical Greek empire, particularly on Syracuse in Sicily, which is being fought over by 2 different Greek polises, city-states. And our protagonist is a foundling who is brought into this family and sort of basically reared by a slave woman who's a cook. But he's also there to provide company for the master of the house. When I say the master, I don't mean the adult, I mean his son, because they're similar age and they're sort of growing up. And this the master's son is a bit of a bully. And what our family doesn't realise is that he's born into slavery. He may not be born into slavery, but he certainly as a foundling has entered into slavery. And he has no idea because no one's ever told him, not even the cook woman. And one day when they find a cat, they want to give, cats suddenly catch on in the island of Syracuse, because previously there weren't any, but they were brought over from Egypt to certain Greek colonies, and now they've come to Syracuse. And so the master gets one for his son, but initially the cat adopts our slave boy and is quite sort of hostile towards the master's son. And it's at that point that the boy realises that the cat cannot be enslaved. The cat is too free-willed to do what it's told. And he starts realising that he needs to be like that he is effective. He realises that he's a slave and that he can never hit the boy back. He must always give in to the boy's whims. So the cat has taught him a lesson. So what he decides is he's going to basically run away, become a runaway slave, which obviously is quite difficult to do. But because the Greek colonies were always because the Greek city-states were always looking to establish colonies to augment their wealth and their military strength, he manages to get on a ship with his cat in order to go and help establish a new Greek colony called Issa. And the rest of the story is set in this colony as it's gradually established from nothing to a fully fledged sort of Greek polis. And one of the we get a new character, which is a donkey, which he manages to sort of take with him as well, because donkeys obviously are sort of, you know, dray animals to carry heavy loads, and they are in, he realises, well, the cat is a free beast, the donkey is the exact opposite. The donkey is a beast of burden. And it's a book about personal freedom, personal liberty, as well as sort of colonisation and taking people, taking away their property and their land and all these sorts of things. It's very light in tone. As I say, it's almost like a fable, that you have these three characters of equal weight: the boy, the donkey, and the cat, and they are equals in terms of their weight in the story, but also in terms of their rights. To the boy they have equal rights. That every time the donkey has to do some work of lugging heavy stone to help build the houses, the boy is dreadfully conflicted and things. And it's also about how language and poetry and democracy and politics, so for example language, how by naming things human beings tame them, domesticate them, bring them under their aegis, but only to exploit them. It's a really interesting take on language and how language is used to exploit and control. So I thought this was terrific, so different from his previous work, but to me it shows me that he's a good writer, because he can write different types of books. So I gave it 5 stars. And on to the hybrid work. So this is Kathleen J. Mead's book Cairn, and it's a book of poems, it's a book of little essays, it's a book of sort of meditative monographs, and it's very much about the threats of climate change to nature. It's all set on the Scottish Isles, I assume the Highlands, and the Isles off the Highlands, and it's just lovely, contemplative, meditative, but with an undertow of threat and menace to the planet. There's a lot about sort of handing on to the next generation, i.e. her children, and the difficulties of that. That she was at Greenham Common protesting the nuclear devices that were stationed there in the 80s, and how with Russia-Ukraine that potentially is back on the agenda, but for her child's generation it's about climate change. And she joins him on a demo. What was it? I can't remember if it's a son or a daughter, but she joins them on a demo, remembering exactly the demos that she went on as a student. And the house, the student house is the same. The posters are different, posters on the wall, but it's basically the same in principle. And just she has great dread that what they're passing on to their children, it's too late. They won't be able to change anything to save the planet. And just two examples. So this is from a poem called Summer. If we are entering a great dismantling, we can hardly expect lyric to survive. How to write a lyric poem. So she's saying, the sheer scale of sort of catastrophe around the corner just, denudes and degrades even poetry. And this is called The Book. There was a book, the first school reader, well, maybe not the very first, that was Janet and John, but Miss Stone sent you off to the older class to ask for theirs, as you could read well enough already. How grown up to be sent up to primary 2 to fetch a book called Daisies in the Sun. You recall the corridor windows, a magic high blue sky above the factories, the ICI works and steel works. Daisies in the sun you asked for in front of the whole class. But no, Miss Gray answered, it is Days in the Sun. And she brought you a copy from the cupboard. Whatever made you recall that moment of possibility, such as you knew as a child, sometime in the morning a long, long time ago. Is she still in there, that infant, skipping down the corridor with a future in her hand? What I like about that, apart from the fact that it's sort of vaguely familiar to events in my own childhood, is that she's skipping with pride that she's the most advanced reader in the class, and she's going out to a higher class to get a book that they read. And then it's punctured because orally she's been told the title, but she's not understood the language enough to appreciate that they're homonyms. Days in the sun, daisies in the sun. And her pride is punctured. I just thought it was fabulous. And this book is an absolute charming, if, as I say, an undertow of dread read. 5 stars. I realise there's a lot of 5-star reads this week. And on to the poetry. So Natalie Diaz, when my brother was an Aztec. So I read her collection, Post-Colonial Love Poem? Something like that. Brilliant. Absolutely love it. I assume this was an earlier collection. Anyway, and it's, again, 5 stars. Yet another one. I just think she's a great poet because she gets emotion down. She manages to find a way to express emotions in words, in poetry. And her brother was a drug addict, which sort of terrorised the family as they sort of kept trying to save his soul, kept taking him back in the house, and then he would keep rebuffing them by stealing stuff or doing crazy things. So the collection titular poem, My Brother Was an Aztec. He lived in our basement and sacrificed my parents every morning. It was awful, unforgivable, but they kept coming back for more. They loved him, was all they could say. It started with him stumbling along La Avenida de los Muertos, my parents walking behind like effigies in a procession. He might burn to the ground at any moment. They didn't know. What else to do except be there to pick him up when he died? They forgot who was dying, who was already dead. My brother quit wearing shirts when a carnival of dirty-breasted women made him their leader. Following him up and down the stairs, they were acrobats, moving, twitching like snakes. They fed him crushed diamonds and fire. He gobbled the gifts. My parents begged him to pluck their eyes out. He thought he was Huitzilopochtli, a god, half man, half hummingbird. My parents at his feet wrecked honeysuckles. He lowered his sword-like mouth, gorged on them, draining colour until their eyebrows whitened. My brother shattered and quartered them before his basement festivals, waved their shaking hearts in his fists. And the poem goes on, but it's so brilliant and visceral, her poetry. Love it. 5 stars. Now, Nick Laird, a Northern Ireland poet, married to Zadie Smith. This is my first exposure to his work. It's his latest work, and I think therein lies the problem. I should have gone back to his earlier work. It's a collection in 3 parts. The middle part is he's sort of keeping vigil at his father's deathbed, and that is brilliantly done. That's worth the price of admission alone. The problem is the first part, because there it's a lot of observations and poems set in places like New York, and it just reeks of a man who's made it. He's no longer in Northern Ireland, he's now moved to New York. He's now, part of the jet set, part of the literati. And there's lots of reference to being stoned and taking this drug and that drug. And to me, when a poet or a writer talks about being stoned or the drugs they take, my spidey senses as a very hostile drug prohibitioner is that the drugs writing the poetry? Is it no longer you? Have the drugs taken over and put themselves front and centre? And I couldn't get past that. I was really disappointed in this collection. The third part is a sort of mishmash of lots. It's not got such a sort of focused theme as the parts 1 and 2. So, yeah, I didn't really get on with this at all. Do I go now and give him a chance by reading some of his earlier work? I think I will, because I am obsessed with Northern Ireland. My novel 3 Dreams of the Kyrgyz was set there. So I want to get more of a sense of his poetry that emanates from Northern Ireland, rather than this sort of globe-trotting, literary, superstar. So I gave this 2.5 stars, and that was mainly for the middle bit about his father's deathbed. And on to Juliana Spahr. This collection of Every Woman with Lungs poems, which are basically 2 long poems, and really, really disappointing. The reason I bought this is because Juliana Spahr has written a piece of literary criticism about the role of the artist, of the poet, of the writer in our current age of sort of dire doomsday politics. And it's this. It's produced by University Press and it costs £20, so it's probably about $25 to $27. It's only about 60 odd pages. Apart from the fact it's really hard to get hold of in Britain because it's an American University Press. And I'm not prepared to pay that, and yet I really want to read the book. So to tide me over until that book becomes more accessible financially, I tracked down some of her poems, and it's this collection. And they're dire. They're sort of schoolboy, schoolgirl stuff to me. I'm no sort of poetry expert, but this is the sort of stuff I imagine a sixth form poet would churn out. So the first poem is about connectivity, how everything has consequences, how there's a sort of chain reaction, so that the breath of a person in a room eventually sort of spools out into sort of the breath of people who are no longer around because they've been killed in wars, the breath of buildings, the breath of the planet, the breath of the cosmos, and then it winds back down again to the individual. Ho-hum. The second poem, which is much, much longer, is her in Hawaii, where she lives, with her partner, becoming news junkies and watching these terrible headlines spool across the news every day. And them being in Hawaii, they feel very distant from events all around the world, such as the invasion of Iraq, such as bridge collapses or terrorist atrocities or Al-Qaeda, or, you know, whatever it is, that they feel very cut off and remote from that. And yet they're part of America, they're one of the American states, therefore they're absolutely involved because their country is bringing about a lot of these sort of terrible events. And that's fine as a theme, but the problem is when you're just scrolling news headlines, which a lot of that poem is made up of, it's not poetic. It's not info dump, but it is info. And it's treated sort of on face value, it's treated without really poetic and literary merit. The only interesting parts is when it's her and her husband, or her partner, are in bed cuddling up to each other, in between and around all these sort of horrible headlines. And that when she goes to bed, she wakes up the next morning and logs on to the next round of atrocities or whatever. Again, sort of, first of all, I think she sinks her own poetic end by having all these news headlines almost verbatim, which, as I say, are not poetic. But then this sort of a very legitimate aim, such as, well, I live in Hawaii, all this is very remote, and yet I'm as culpable as anyone else because I'm American, and America causes a lot of this. But because of the way she's chosen to do it with like sort of listing news headlines, it just felt very sort of basic schoolboy, schoolgirlish poetry. So I'm afraid this didn't work for me at all. 2 stars. And finally for Frederike Mayrocker, this was her final poetry collection shortly before she died. It's done, every poem has a timestamp on it. So it starts off in January 2017 and ends in 2019, I think. Yeah, and she died, I think, in 2020. And this was a pure poetry reading experience, by which I mean not sort of pure classical rhyme and scansion and all of that stuff. More that it's poetry that just says, look, don't try and interpret this. Don't try and join the dots. Just bask in this thing called poetry, this thing called lyricism. You know, the imagery, the rhythm, the internal assonance, of which there is plenty. But it doesn't form a concrete structure. And that's the beauty of it. So, you know, I just read this. It's 200 pages. I read 100 pages in one day and 100 pages in the other. And I just basked in it. I just let it flow over me and infuse by osmosis whatever I did infuse. So I'm just going to read briefly one of the more sort of accessible poems. I'd lost it in my flat. They were lost. I couldn't find them again. They were a piece of me, but sentences had got lost. I let my eye rest on the shapes of my room once again, find the strangest objects, those I've been looking for too. The gentian, how it fevers against my words. One says evening red, but morning redness, etc. As if at every third line I wanted to swing around the corner. It spoons so silvery blue in the early morning, that is, in the window. A little of this puffed up, tufted up, sitting together with friends, so brushed up, like a hairdo. These tiny hairs on the tile floor, brackets bathroom. The mixed portraits already fragrant. I gave him a lectern for Easter, where he was supposed to write like Goethe. Beat snow, etc. The ground's already cooling down. White cloud wigs. Oh, cloud beloved, how your disappearance lasts. The forest of this beloved, deep shrouded, sealed, passed away. My hand, my mouth are looking for you. The memory delightful, the moss with naked feet, the moss enraptured, this book, I. Where can I find roe, dear, are you roe? Some poem or other lying on the floor, these words always slipping away from me. So, little tongue, I'm worried about you, as if the vanished words turn up again, but it was only a wisp or wound. I loved it. 4 stars. I will say that it had the sense, because they're date stamped, it had the sense of her recording her final impressions over these years. There's lots of stuff about music. She's reacting to paintings that she's remembering, the images in paintings. There are people that she's met, some alive, some dead by this time, that sort of reacting to photos. Now, whether they're in front of her or not, she's casting back in her memory. So it's very much poetry drawn from memory or about her memory, and hence that's why it's quite fragmented and associative, but very, very worthwhile reading. I've ordered an earlier book of hers, collection called Etudes. And that's it, BookTube. So thanks very much. Till next time.